Hey guys, it is Sarah, and I just want to start this video off with a little bit of a disclaimer because I'm not a lawyer. So this video is not meant to be legal advice in any way, but it is a summary of my understanding of this law and how it affects handlers of assistance animals. So with that aside, let's jump right into it. So the Fair Housing Act is the law that we're going to be focusing on. And this law is meant to protect people from discrimination when they are renting or buying a home, when they're getting a mortgage, when they're seeking housing assistance, or they need help in other housing related activities. It does have certain groups that it is specifically meant to protect, and these protected classes are based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. And this video is going to be focusing on disability. So if we're looking at how the FHA protects you with disability, it protects you in a couple different ways. One, it allows you an avenue to redress certain discriminations that you may have faced or you might think you might be facing. In another direction, it allows you to request reasonable accommodation, which is the focus of this video. Reasonable accommodation can vary from anything to installing different hardware that makes things easier with your disability, like a ramp or something like that. Or for this video, we're going to be focusing on reasonable accommodation that protects handlers with assistance animals. So that means accommodation that is exemption from a no pet policy, or exemption from certain breed or size restrictions, exemption from pet fees or things like that, because those aren't supposed to apply to assistance animals. So what types of housing are covered under the Fair Housing Act? Well, the Fair Housing Act covers most types of housing in the United States, which is great. But there are some exemptions that you should be aware of. One of these exemptions, if it is a owner-occupied building with no more than 4 units, so a lot of handlers have a base rule that is, if the owner of the unit has less than 4 units, they're probably not covered. Another situation is single-family houses or homes that are sold or rented by the owner without the use of another agent, so you're not using a realtor or a broker. A third is housing that's operated by religious organizations, and then private clubs that limit occupancy to members. This last one sounds a little bit like a homeowners association to some people, but the vast majority, almost all homeowners associations, still fall under the Fair Housing Act. So it is important to understand that as you're approaching maybe a situation that you're having with a homeowners association. So what assistance animals are covered under the Fair Housing Act? Well, in 2013, the Department of Housing and Urban Development sent out an FHA notice, which basically detailed all the information you need to know about the Fair Housing Act and assistance animals, which is super helpful. It's very detailed. It will be linked below. But they define an assistance animal as an animal that works, provides assistance, or performs tasks for the benefit of a person with a disability, or they provide emotional support that alleviates one or more identified symptoms or effects of an individual's disability. Now, this means that if we break down this definition, it includes service animals, emotional support animals, and service animals in training, all under the same umbrella term of assistance animals. It also includes animals of almost all species. So it could be an alligator, maybe not an alligator, it could be a lizard, and it would fall under this category. Now, for the purpose of reasonable accommodations request, the FHA does not require that an assistance animal is individually trained or certified. So landlords can't ask for certification or registration as an assistance animal. This last thing might have you questioning, well, what can my landlord ask? Well, your landlord might not be allowed to ask anything. For example, if the disability that you have and the reason for the animal for that disability is very apparent, they can't ask for further documentation. So if someone is low vision or blind and they use a guide dog, that is an apparent disability and use of an animal. You can see that from meeting a person. Another situation would be if someone is in a wheelchair and they use the animal to pull the wheelchair. That is also apparent. You can see that. The issue is that most people with disabilities have invisible disabilities, and most people with assistance animals don't have an assistance animal whose reason is so apparent as those two examples. So in those situations, a landlord may ask for documentation from a medical provider. They cannot ask for specific medical details or your medical history or your diagnosis, but they can ask for documentation that answers two questions. And these two questions are, does the person have a disability? And they define disability the same way the ADA does, which a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And the documentation also has to say, too, that does the person making this request have a disability-related need for the animal? So you don't just have to be disabled, but you have to have a disability-related need for this animal. That information is all your documentation from a medical provider has to have. You have a disability, you have a disability-related need for this animal in your housing situation. So knowing that, you might have some questions on in what situations your landlord can refuse or deny a reasonable accommodation request, because landlords have rights as well. So these requests can be denied when the two questions aren't answered adequately or necessary documentation is not provided. If you move an animal into a housing situation without prior accommodation, this could mess with your chances to ever get that accommodation. In addition, if it would impose undue financial or administrative burden or would fundamentally alter the nature of a housing provider's services, it could also change their ability to approve that reasonable accommodation. So a situation where that applies is if their insurance, the insurance that the housing unit is under, if that insurance would drastically go up because of, say, having a pit bull in the building, they could deny you based on that. That is not a breed restriction that they are arbitrarily making up, but it would cause undue financial burden onto them. The request could also be denied if the specific assistance animal in question poses a direct threat to the health and safety of others that cannot be reduced or eliminated by another reasonable accommodation, or if the specific animal in question would cause substantial physical damage to the property of others that can't be reduced or eliminated by another accommodation. Now, when looking at these, you are supposed to not look at it as a broad situation. So you can't look at, say, a pit bull breed like we mentioned earlier. You can't say, well, I think they're dangerous and I think they pose a safety risk, so we're going to deny that person. That's not how it works. They are told that they have to do an individualized assessment that includes objective evidence about that specific animal's behavior. So if a specific animal has a bite history, if they are showing aggressive behavior, if there's some reason for them to believe that that specific animal, because of their behavior and their history, is going to act in a certain way, it can be denied based on that because of the safety of others and others' property. Now that you know a little bit more about the Fair Housing Act itself, you might want to know what steps you need to take so that you can have your assistance animal live with you in your current location or in a future housing situation. The first step you need to take is to know your stuff. Do your research. If you want some more resources after watching this video, definitely check out the description down below for some links. You also want to make sure that you know whether or not your landlord does fall under the FHA. I mentioned some exemptions earlier in the video, and if they aren't covered under the FHA, then the law doesn't protect you as a tenant there. The second step is to make your reasonable accommodation request at the right time. So if you're already living in a situation, you want to send in that request and have that request approved before you bring any animal on the property. If you're looking at future properties, you're looking to rent in a new place, then a lot of handlers suggest that you don't even make any mention of a reasonable accommodation or of an assistance animal until you are approved for a lease. This is because there are so many steps along the process in which they could discriminate against you, and you wouldn't really have a whole lot of legal recourse because it's hard to prove. Once you are approved for a lease, if you make a reasonable accommodation request and they drop your lease, then you can press charges or find resources legally to help you because you've been discriminated against. It's much easier if you have that paper trail. In addition, once you are approved for a lease, if you make that accommodation request, ask them to write it into your lease. That way, in the future, you have a written agreement that tells exactly what your agreement is regarding this reasonable accommodation of having an assistance animal living with you. So in that reasonable accommodation request, what I did is I included a link to the FHA notice from 2013 that I mentioned earlier in the video. That is linked down below. I sent that to my landlord along with my request so that they knew what their rights were and they knew what my rights were. That way we were on the same page about what they could and could not ask. Next, your landlord is probably going to ask you for documentation. Make sure you provide the correct documentation and that you're professional in this entire thing. Sometimes it can feel as if we are being discriminated against or someone is uneducated and it might rub us the wrong way, and it's very easy to get heated in these situations because they tend to be very personal. But it's important to remain professional and to have a good working relationship, because if you end up living here, this is going to be your landlord and you need to have a good relationship with them in order to have a successful living arrangement. So after your request is approved, if it's written into your lease, you want to read that backwards, frontwards, upside down. You want to make sure you know that lease in and out because you want to know what you're agreeing to. It's a legal document and you are signing it with knowledge that you're being bound to what's in that document. So you want to make sure that you know what you're signing and that you actually agree to it, because signing it means that you are agreeing to it. So once you're approved and you have this approval in writing with both your landlord's signature and your signature or some sort of equivalent of that, then you are good to go. You can now bring your animal onto the property. It is very important that you don't bring the animal onto the property until you have this approval in writing, because if you don't, it could put some roadblocks in the way in the future and maybe even prevent you from getting accommodation later down the road. It is also important to consider that guests might not have to follow these same things. Guests often fall under the ADA, but some leases describe what is a guest and what is an occupant. So for example, some leases describe that if a guest is staying for longer than 3 days, they are now an occupant. So you might have to, for a guest that is staying for a week in your apartment, you might have to get reasonable accommodation approval for that. But if they're only staying for 3 days, you'd be fine. So make sure you know your lease and you know when you need to submit for accommodation approval for a guest. But most of the time, guests will fall under the ADA. And the last thing is, if you think you're being discriminated against, always reach out to resources. Being disabled is hard enough, and being discriminated against for that is very difficult, and there are resources available. You can contact your local federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is the HUD, or you could contact the Department of Justice or any number of legal resources in your area. Don't go through it alone if you are being discriminated against, and make sure you have the correct legal resources to help you out. I'm not a legal resource. I'm not a lawyer. But with that said, thank you so much for watching. I really hope this video was able to help some people. I know it was super overwhelming when I was trying to figure all of this out. So I hope I was able to help simplify it a little bit, but not too simplified because I wanted it to be detailed still. So definitely let me know if you have any comments, suggestions, questions down below in the comments. Check out the description for more information, and as always, subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you get notified when I send out my next video. I'll see you in my next video. Thanks guys, bye.